Justice or injustice? The man who saved a bank lost everything. When armed robbers storm Grand Trust Bank, security officer Malcolm Carter risks his life to protect innocent customers. But just as the danger fades, the police arrive and arrest him as a suspect. Betrayed by the very system he served, Malcolm must fight to clear his name while uncovering a sinister conspiracy lurking behind the heist. As powerful forces work to silence him, the real criminals walk free. Will Malcolm prove his innocence before it's too late, or will justice remain out of reach? The afternoon rush had just begun at Grand Trust Bank. Customers filled the lobby, some waiting in line, others seated in chairs by the large windows. The steady hum of conversation mixed with the distant clicking of keyboards as tellers handled transactions behind thick glass dividers. Malcolm Carter stood near the entrance, keeping an eye on the room. As a security officer, he had learned to read people, to pick up on small details that others overlooked. His posture was relaxed, but his mind was alert. That was when he noticed them. 3 men pushed through the glass doors, moving with purpose. Their faces were covered with ski masks, and each carried a gun. One of them fired a shot into the ceiling. "Everybody down," the gunman shouted. Screams filled the bank as customers dropped to the floor, shielding their heads. A woman clutched her young daughter, her face frozen with fear. A man in a suit pressed himself against the counter, his hands trembling. Malcolm didn't hesitate. His training kicked in. He moved quickly, staying low as he assessed the situation. The leader of the group ordered the tellers to empty the registers, shoving a duffel bag toward one of them. Another robber pointed his weapon at the customers, daring anyone to make a move. But the third man, he was careless. His attention drifted for just a second, and Malcolm saw his chance. He sprang forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the floor. The robber let out a pained yell, but Malcolm didn't stop. He knocked the man off balance, forcing him to the ground and pinning him down with his knee. The leader turned, gun raised. "Let him go." Malcolm didn't move. He tightened his grip, pressing the man's arm against the cold tile. The second robber shifted his aim from the crowd to Malcolm, his hand steady, finger on the trigger. Then sirens. The shriek of police vehicles filled the street outside. Tires screeched as officers poured in, weapons drawn. Everything happened in an instant. "Freeze!" Malcolm lifted his hands, his breath steady. "I'm security," he started, but the words barely left his mouth before an officer grabbed his arm, wrenching it behind his back. Another officer shoved him to the floor. The weight of a knee pressed against his back. The cold metal of handcuffs locked around his wrists. "Stand down." Malcolm tried again. "I work here." "Yeah? Then why do you have a gunman under you?" The real robbers took their chance. With the officers focused on Malcolm, they bolted. The leader grabbed the duffel bag, shoving a teller aside as he sprinted toward the back exit. The remaining gunman followed, knocking over a display stand in his rush to escape. "Suspects fleeing," someone shouted. Chaos erupted. Officers scrambled to pursue the escaping robbers, but Malcolm remained pinned to the floor. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from frustration. He had done his job. He had stopped one of them. And now, he was being treated like a criminal. A voice crackled through a radio. "We have one suspect in custody." Malcolm clenched his jaw. "I'm not one of them." The officer barely glanced at him as he yanked Malcolm to his feet. "Tell it to the detectives." Around him, bank employees and customers slowly sat up, their frightened faces watching as he was led toward the exit. Not a single person spoke up. Not the manager, not the tellers, no one. The heavy door swung open, and Malcolm was marched outside into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting patrol cars. The afternoon air was thick, the sounds of distant traffic muffled by the weight of what had just happened. The true criminals were getting away, and Malcolm Carter, the man who had tried to stop them, was the one in handcuffs. Malcolm sat in the cold, windowless interrogation room, his hands still cuffed. The metal chair beneath him was hard, the table scratched and worn. A single overhead light buzzed softly, casting sharp shadows on the walls. He kept his back straight, his mind steady. This was a mistake. It had to be. The door swung open, and a tall officer stepped inside, followed by a woman in a dark blazer. She dropped a folder onto the table and pulled out a chair. Her expression gave nothing away as she settled in front of him. "Malcolm Carter," she said, opening the file. security officer at Grand Trust Bank for 7 years. Malcolm nodded. And I expect to walk out of here once you check the surveillance footage. She lifted her eyes to his. That's the problem. The officer standing by the door crossed his arms. The bank won't confirm your side of the story. Malcolm frowned. What do you mean? The cameras. The footage is unclear, the woman interrupted. And the bank's management won't vouch for you. A strange pressure built in Malcolm's chest. That doesn't make sense. I stopped one of the robbers. The employees saw it. The customer saw it. The officer shook his head. No one's backing you up. The manager claims they can't confirm anything. Malcolm's fingers curled into fists. He had worked there for years, protected that bank, its employees, its customers. And now silence. I need to speak to the bank manager myself, Malcolm said, his voice firm. The woman sighed. That's not going to happen. Before he could push further, the door opened again. A man in a gray suit stepped inside, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. His presence filled the room with a different kind of authority. Malcolm recognized him immediately. James Holloway, his lawyer. Relief tried to settle in, but it couldn't quite take hold. Holloway placed his briefcase on the table and remained standing. I need a moment alone with my client. The officer and the woman exchanged glances, then left the room. The door clicked shut behind them. Holloway wasted no time. This is bad, Malcolm. Malcolm leaned forward. Tell me something I don't know. His lawyer's usual calm was strained. The prosecution is building a case against you. They're saying you were the inside man, that you helped plan the robbery. Malcolm stared at him. That's ridiculous. They claim it explains how the robbers got in and out so fast, how they knew exactly where to go. And with the bank refusing to support you, it's looking bad. The room felt smaller. This is a setup. Holloway nodded. I believe you, but belief doesn't win cases. Evidence does. Right now, we have nothing. A heavy silence stretched between them. Malcolm rubbed his hands together, thinking. Someone inside the bank is covering something up. That's the only thing that makes sense. Holloway tapped his fingers against the table. If that's true, we need to prove it before they bury you under false charges. Malcolm exhaled sharply. He had risked everything to stop those robbers, and now the people he had protected were letting him take the fall. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He sat on the stiff cot in his holding cell, staring at the gray concrete wall. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and stale coffee from the officers pacing outside. His lawyer's words from earlier echoed in his mind. No evidence. No witnesses. The footage should have been enough to clear him, yet it had somehow vanished. Now, without proof, the police saw only what they wanted. A man on the ground with one of the robbers. The real criminals were gone, and he was the only one left to take the fall. The clanking of metal jolted him from his thoughts. An officer unlocked the cell door. Carter, let's go. Your lawyer's here. Malcolm stood, his muscles stiff from hours of waiting. He was led down a narrow hallway to a meeting room where James Holloway was already seated, flipping through a stack of papers. His expression was tight, his eyes sharp with frustration. Malcolm sat across from him. Tell me you have something. Holloway sighed, pushing a sheet toward him. The prosecution isn't backing down. Without the footage, they're sticking to their story, that you were working with the robbers. Malcolm clenched his fists. There were people in that bank who saw what happened. The woman with her daughter. I pulled them to safety. They can tell the truth. Holloway's expression darkened. That's another problem. We can't find them. Malcolm's stomach dropped. What do you mean? The mother and child haven't come forward. No one remembers their names. No contact info. It's like they disappeared. Malcolm shook his head. No. She was there. She was real. Someone's making sure she stays quiet. Holloway rubbed his temple. It's looking like more than just a mistake, Malcolm. Someone wants this case wrapped up fast. Malcolm frowned. The detective on my case, something about him felt off. He didn't ask many questions, just acted like I was guilty from the start. Holloway nodded. Detective Grant. He's been handling all the evidence, or what's left of it. Malcolm leaned forward. You think he's involved? Holloway lowered his voice. I think someone doesn't want this case open too long. The missing footage, the disappearing witness, it all points to something bigger. Malcolm sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a robbery anymore. Someone was pulling the strings, and he was trapped in the middle of it. If he wanted to prove his innocence, he'd have to find out who and why. Malcolm was sitting in his cell. The air smelled of sweat and disinfectant, and every sound from the other cells carried through the cold space. He had spent days inside this place, but tonight felt different. Something was shifting, and not in his favor. His lawyer, James Holloway, had visited earlier, bringing more bad news. The prosecution was digging through Malcolm's past, looking for anything they could use against him. They had found minor incidents, things from years ago that never mattered before. A late payment on a fine, a teenage scuffle that never led to charges. Suddenly, they were being painted as proof of a pattern, as if Malcolm had been a criminal all along. They're using whatever they can to justify keeping you here, Holloway had said, rubbing his temples. They're pushing for no bail, claiming you're a flight risk. Malcolm had clenched his fists under the table. You and I both know that's garbage. Holloway had nodded. We need something solid to fight back. Now, hours later, Malcolm lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. The jail was never quiet. Metal doors clanked in the distance. A guard's footsteps passed by, then faded. A man in another cell muttered to himself. Sleep never came easy here. The next morning, Holloway returned with a lead. There's a name that keeps coming up in the background of this case, he said as they sat across from each other in the visitor's room. Thomas Vance, senior executive at Grand Trust Bank. Malcolm frowned. Never met him. What about him? Holloway leaned in. He's got connections. Powerful ones. And there are whispers that he's tied to the men who robbed the bank. A chill ran through Malcolm. You think he set this up? I think he wants you out of the picture. Malcolm exhaled through his nose. You have proof. Not yet. But we're close. Holloway hesitated before continuing. I found the woman you saved. The mother with the little boy. Malcolm sat up straighter. That's great. She can tell them what really happened. Holloway's jaw tightened. She's terrified, Malcolm. Someone got to her first. Malcolm's pulse quickened. What do you mean? She won't talk. She says someone warned her to stay quiet, that if she speaks, she and her son won't be safe. Malcolm shook his head. They're scaring her into silence. Holloway nodded. That's what it looks like. Malcolm pressed his hands against the table. The bank, the police, the criminals. They're all in this together, aren't they? Holloway didn't answer right away. He looked around, as if checking for listening ears, then lowered his voice. It's starting to feel that way. A guard stepped forward, signaling that time was up. Holloway stood, grabbing his briefcase. I'll keep digging. Stay strong. Malcolm returned to his cell, frustration burning in his chest. They were stacking the deck against him, cutting off every way out. But if there was one thing he knew, it was this. The truth always found a way to break through. Days passed. Then, late one evening, a guard stopped at Malcolm's cell. Your lawyer's here, he said, unlocking the door. Holloway sat waiting in the small interview room, his face tense. He slid a flash drive across the table. Someone inside the department gave me this. Security footage from a bank. Malcolm grabbed it. The missing footage. Holloway nodded. If it's real, this could clear you. Malcolm gritted his teeth. We need to get this in front of Judge. But Holloway didn't move. His fingers drummed lightly against his briefcase. Then he spoke, voice low. Someone doesn't want that to happen. Malcolm stared at him. What? They came to me. Told me to drop the case. Said if I keep pushing, there will be consequences. Malcolm's grip on the table tightened. Who? Holloway shook his head. They didn't say. But they made it clear. If I don't back off, I'll regret it. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Malcolm spoke. Are you going to quit? Holloway exhaled sharply. Then, he picked up the flash drive and tucked it into his pocket. No, but we have to be careful. They're playing dirty, and they're not done yet. Malcolm's mind was spinning. The missing security footage was in Holloway's hands, but that wasn't enough. He needed someone on the outside, someone who still believed in him. There was only one person who came to mind, Detective Ray Carter. Ray had been a friend once, back when Malcolm worked security at smaller firms. They had crossed paths during a case years ago, and Malcolm had seen firsthand that Ray wasn't like the others. He still cared about the truth. Malcolm asked to make a call. The guard eyed him suspiciously, but handed over the phone. He dialed the number from memory, heart pounding as it rang. Carter. Malcolm gripped the receiver. Ray, it's me. There was a pause. Then a sigh. Malcolm, you shouldn't be calling me. I wouldn't if I had a choice. You know I didn't do this. Ray didn't answer right away. I read the reports. They're lying. I have proof, security footage from the bank. Ray lowered his voice. If you really have that, you're in more danger than you realize. Malcolm closed his eyes for a second. Then help me. A long pause. Then, meet me in the visitation room tomorrow. The next day, Malcolm sat across from Ray in the small room, watching as the detective leaned in. I pulled some strings and got a look at your case, Ray said. It stinks. There are too many holes. Holloway placed the flash drive on the table. This is what they don't want you to see. Ray hesitated, then took it. I'll see what I can do. Hours later, Malcolm waited in his cell, tension clawing at his chest. Then, the news broke. The footage had been leaked to the media. It played on every station. The video showed Malcolm shielding customers, taking down one of the robbers, and never once reaching for the stolen money. The narrative was collapsing, and the DA was forced to review the case. But the fight wasn't over. That night, Holloway rushed into the interview room, breathless. They tried to kill her. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Who? The witness. The woman you saved. Someone ran her off the road. She's in the hospital. Malcolm pushed back his chair. They're getting desperate. Holloway nodded grimly. And they're not done. A cold dread settled over Malcolm. He wasn't safe. Not in here. Not anywhere. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office, Thomas Vance slammed his fist against the desk. The footage should never have gotten out. Across from him, a man in uniform leaned forward, face unreadable. We have a problem. If Carter and Holloway keep digging, they'll trace it back to us. Vance's hands curled into fists. Then eliminate the problem. Back at the jail, Malcolm was being moved for a court hearing when the officers escorting him suddenly changed direction. They led him down an empty hallway, away from the usual path. Alarm bells rang in his head. Where are we going? One of the officers pulled out a key and unlocked an unmarked door. Special transfer. Malcolm's pulse hammered. He wasn't being transferred. He was being silenced. Just as they stepped inside, a voice rang out. Hold it. Ray Carter appeared at the end of the hall, gun drawn. Let him go. The officers hesitated. Then, the one holding Malcolm shoved him forward and reached for his weapon. Ray fired a warning shot. The officers froze. More officers rushed in, this time wearing department-issued badges. The corrupt ones knew they were outnumbered. They dropped their weapons. Ray grabbed Malcolm by the arm. Come on. You're getting out of here. An hour later, Malcolm sat in a safe house, rubbing his hands together as Holloway paced. They won't stop. Not until the whole thing collapses. Ray pulled out his phone. Then let's make sure it does. Malcolm frowned. What are you doing? Ray hit record and placed the phone on the table. Calling Vance. The phone rang. Then, a sharp voice answered. What? Ray spoke calmly. It's done. We have Malcolm. No more loose ends. A pause. Then, good. Make sure it stays that way. Ray pushed. And the money? A chuckle. You'll get it once the trial is over. Can't have any surprises. Ray ended the call and looked at Malcolm. That's all we need. The recording was leaked. By morning, the city was in an uproar. The DA had no choice but to drop the charges. Vance, the corrupt officers, and the bank executives were all taken down in a massive scandal. Malcolm was free, but as he stepped out into the fresh air, he didn't feel like celebrating. The system that had nearly destroyed him was still standing. There were others like him, people trapped in a fight they couldn't win. Holloway clapped a hand on his shoulder. It's over. Malcolm looked at the skyline, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Not yet, because for others, the fight was just beginning.